Imagine you break your arm, right? Like you hear the snap, you go to the hospital.
Yeah, you head straight to the emergency room.
Exactly. And the doctor puts you in front of an X-ray machine, and, well, there it is. A jagged white line on a black background.
It's totally visible. It's measurable.
Right. You can point to the exact location where the structural integrity of your bone just failed, and honestly, we find that comforting.
Oh, absolutely. We love a visible problem.
Yeah, we like our problems to be physical, isolated, and, easy to point at. But think about what happens when you step away from the physical body and try to diagnose an entire society.
Right. Suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Completely useless. You cannot just put a culture or an economy or a political structure on a table and take a picture of its internal fractures.
No, you can't.
So finding the invisible structural rot beneath the surface of a civilization, that requires an entirely different kind of diagnostic tool. And that is exactly what we are building for you today.
We really are.
Yeah, so welcome to your custom deep dive. Today, we are taking a stack of incredibly intense analytical lectures focusing on Surah 27 of the Quran.
Specifically the story of the ancient civilization of Thamud.
Right. And our mission today is to completely strip away the historical window dressing.
We are not treating this as a religious fairy tale.
No, we're not doing a Sunday school lesson. We are reading this foundational text strictly as a masterclass in systems engineering and sociology.
Yeah, and honestly, treating this material as anything other than a textbook on civilizational survival is a massive disservice to the text itself.
Absolutely.
The overarching frame we are exploring today is the structural mechanics of how a society destroys itself.
Notice the phrasing there, right? A society destroys itself.
Exactly. It's an internal failure. The collapse we're analyzing today doesn't come from some moody deity throwing a supernatural lightning bolt because people misbehaved.
Right. It's not a cartoon.
No. The collapse is the mathematical result of a systemic, calculated elimination of a society's own internal correction mechanisms. Yeah, we are analyzing an architectural failure. Pure and simple.
So the hook here completely reorients everything you might have heard about this story. We need to start by exploding what I call the evil criminals myth.
Oh, I love this part. This is crucial.
Right, because when we look at the apex of the Thamud power structure, traditional narratives, well, the really simplistic retellings, they usually present the villains as cartoonish thugs.
Yeah, just guys causing trouble for the sake of it.
Exactly. Like, verse 27.48 mentions 9 men in the city. And for centuries, commentators have just brushed past these 9 men, framing them as street criminals acting out of, base malice.
We're just morally corrupt evildoers who liked causing chaos.
Right. But looking closely at the linguistic precision of the source material, the text paints a chillingly different picture.
It really does. The vocabulary used in the source material completely changes the paradigm. We move from theology straight into sociology.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the text does not call them evil men in the personal sense. It uses a highly technical term, fasidun fayalor. And in English translations, you usually see this rendered as corruptors on earth.
But corruptors still carries a heavy moralistic baggage, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Like it sounds like a judgment on their personal character. Maybe they drank too much, maybe they cheated on their taxes, or maybe they were just cruel people.
Right, but the lectures we are using as our source material insist that facade is not about personal morality at all.
So what is it?
Facade is the corruption of the productive system itself. Think about the root of the word, SSD.
Okay.
It is basically the linguistic equivalent of thermodynamic decay.
Yeah.
It's the word you use for milk that is spoiled and curdled,
Oh.
or iron that is rusted, or a wooden beam that has been eaten by termites. So when applied to sociology, facade is the deterioration of the social architecture that makes collective life viable.
Okay, wait. So if that's the case, these 9 men are not a street gang roaming the alleyways.
Not at all.
They are a planning committee.
Exactly, a planning committee.
That fundamentally shifts the entire power dynamic. They aren't the desperate underclass breaking windows because they're starving.
No, they are the elite.
Mm-hmm.
They are strategists operating in the capital city, sitting in what essentially amounts to a boardroom.
A corporate boardroom.
Basically, yeah. They are the apex of the Thamud power structure.
Yeah.
They hold all the levers of the state. And the text provides their specific strategy in verse 27.49.
Which is what?
They are orchestrating a highly coordinated political assassination operation against the reformer of their era, a man named Salih.
Okay, so they're plotting a hit.
A major hit. The 9 men swear an oath to attack Salih and his family by night.
Right.
And then, crucially, and this is the really wild part, they establish their PR strategy before the murder even takes place.
Yes, I noticed that.
They agree to look his guardian in the eye the next morning and say, "We did not witness the destruction of his family, and indeed, we are truthful."
See, I found myself totally stuck on that specific detail.
Oh.
Because if they are the apex of power, right? If they control the state apparatus, the military, the economy, why are they sneaking around in the dark to kill one man?
It's a great question.
Why not just execute him in the town square? Like, if you have all the power, just use it.
Well, looking at modern systemic corruption gives us the exact answer to that. True institutional elites cannot just act with raw, unadulterated brutality in broad daylight.
Because it looks bad.
More than looking bad, using raw force exposes the fact that your power is illegitimate. It signals to the populace that you rely on violence, not consensus or the rule of law.
So they have to preserve the illusion of systemic legitimacy.
Preserving that illusion is paramount for any vested interest. These 9 men are executing a calculated removal of a structural threat, but they are doing it with a pre-planned alibi.
They need the rest of the society to wake up the next morning and believe the system is still functioning normally.
Exactly. They need the stock market to open, they need the workers to go to the fields, they need the machinery of the state to grind on without any interruption.
Because a daylight execution triggers an uprising.
Right. But a midnight assassination with a fabricated cover-up, that maintains the structural integrity of their monopoly.
It's an institutional cover-up planned before the crime is even committed. It's like, we'll do the hit at night, and in the morning we'll act as the lead investigators into the tragic death of our esteemed citizen.
Yes. It is terrifyingly modern.
It really is. And, to truly understand why this elite planning committee calculated that Salih had to die, we have to look closer at the role of the reformer in any social system.
We do.
The text makes a very specific point about Salih's relationship to the people of Thamud. Verse 27.45 says, he was sent to them as their brother.
Yeah, and the phrasing their brother is not just a nice sentiment, it's an engineering specification.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, the reformer always emerges from within the system. Salih is not a foreign invader crossing the border with some alien ideology. He was born there.
Okay, I see.
He understands the culture, the economy, the implicit rules of the game. In systems engineering terms, he is the system's own internal diagnostic tool.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to phrase it. An internal diagnostic tool?
Exactly. He is the subroutine that runs a check on the main board and alerts the system to a critical error.
And when you expose a systemic flaw from the inside, the reaction of the system is immediate.
Immediate and drastic.
Yeah, because the text says that the moment Salih begins broadcasting the diagnostic error, the community divides.
Right.
But it doesn't divide into a messy spectrum of opinions. The source material highlights the word fakawat. They divided into exactly 2 factions. It is a sharp, undeniable binary.
Yeah, and that's key. A society facing a structural critique never fractures into a nice little bell curve of moderate disagreement.
No middle ground.
The middle ground completely evaporates. There are only 2 factions. Those who process the reformer's message as empirical evidence of systemic flaw, and those who reject the evidence to maintain the status quo.
Wow.
You either acknowledge the rot in the wooden beam, or you aggressively defend the structural integrity of the house. There is no in-between.
Think about the sociological implications of that binary split for a second.
Right.
In a tribal society like Thamud, blood and genetics are everything, right? Your allegiance is to your cousin, your uncle, your tribe.
That's the foundation of their entire world.
But the moment the internal diagnostic tool flashes red and you choose to align with the evidence, your old social ties become totally obsolete.
Exactly. Ideology replaces genetics as the social glue.
Which is wild. If my brother defends the systemic rot and a stranger from the underclass acknowledges the evidence for reform, that stranger is now my ally.
Which is, frankly, the most disruptive event possible for an entrenched elite.
I can imagine.
The Mallas, the elite councils, they rely on traditional hierarchies, tribal loyalty, and predictable social divisions to maintain their power.
They need people divided along those old lines.
Right. They pit the working classes against each other based on bloodlines. Salih introduces a new paradigm where the defining characteristic of a citizen is based on their relationship to the truth of the system's failure.
And that completely shatters the old power base.
Utterly shatters it.
So that raises the fundamental question, right? Why did the system need correcting in the first place?
Right, what was the actual issue?
Yeah, what was the material reality of Thamud that triggered this internal diagnostic tool to go off? Because we have to look at the economic root of the crisis. The source material is adamant that this is not a debate about abstract theology.
No, not at all.
This is a battleground over material resources.
Very much so. The economy of Thamud was heavily based on agriculture and livestock, and the elite, this Mala, had systematically monopolized the vital resources required for survival.
So they controlled the necessities.
Everything. They had taken control of the water springs and the fertile pastures, and, they didn't just stumble into this monopoly. They engineered it by force and manipulation.
So they rigged the game so their massive herds could graze freely and drink their fill.
Exactly.
While the weaker classes, the marginalized citizens who actually provided the labor, were left with absolutely nothing.
Right. And when you monopolize water in a livestock economy, you aren't just getting rich. You are functionally starving the working class.
They're putting a chokehold on the basic means of survival.
Yes. Salih emerges into this environment of extreme economic disparity. And his core argument, the thesis of his entire reform, is summarized in the phrase, "The land belongs to God."
See, to a modern ear conditioned by centuries of religious sentimentality, that just sounds like a call to prayer.
It does. It sounds very spiritual.
Right. But read through the socioeconomic lens of the source material. It is a radical economic manifesto.
It is incredibly radical. The land belongs to God is a direct attack on extreme privatization.
Okay, unpack that.
It means that the fundamental means of production and natural resources cannot be the private monopoly of a few elites.
Right.
You cannot claim exclusive ownership over the water that falls from the sky or the grass that grows from the earth to the detriment of the public. It is an argument that essential public goods must remain open to all.
Which brings us to the most famous and probably the most misunderstood symbol in the story of Thamud.
The she-camel.
The she-camel. Because in traditional lore, the she-camel is treated as this magical entity, right? Like a miraculous fairy tale creature produced to dazzle the masses.
A parlor trick, basically.
Yeah. But the analytical lecture completely discards that view.
Totally throws it out.
The camel was not a magic trick. It was a tangible, living stress test of this new economic principle.
Exactly. God's she-camel on God's earth. Salih produces this camel and says, essentially, if you truly accept the principle that natural resources are not your private monopoly, let this camel graze freely. Let it drink from the water source equally.
Because the camel represents the marginalized, right, the public interest.
It is the ultimate open source requirement.
I love that analogy, open source.
Yeah. Think about it. When a regulatory body looks at a massive modern tech giant that controls all internet infrastructure and says, you must allow independent developers equal access to your bandwidth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They are imposing a stress test on the monopoly. The camel is the demand for equal access to the infrastructure of survival.
And when you force a monopoly to open source its most valuable asset, the reaction is never compliance.
Never. It is always violence.
Always. The 9 men, the planning committee, plot to kill the camel. But the text makes a profound psychological point about their motivation.
This is a really subtle detail.
They didn't hamstring the she-camel because there wasn't enough grass or water to go around.
No, they weren't running out of resources.
Right. The source material notes that Thamud was prosperous, there was plenty of water, so they killed it because of ego.
Ego and status preservation.
Yeah.
Having to share equally with the underclass, having to watch the living symbol of the public interest drink from the exact same spring as their prized, monopolized herds.
It drove them crazy.
It shattered their sense of inherent superiority. They couldn't tolerate the visual representation of equality.
It wasn't about resource scarcity at all.
Not even a little bit. It was about the humiliation of losing their exclusive status.
So, when the economic monopoly was challenged by undeniable empirical evidence, the evidence that the system was rotting and needed reform, the elite retreated to a specific intellectual defense mechanism.
Right.
And this brings us to the tyranny of unproven assertions. We really have to look closely at the bad faith of the Mala.
The bad faith is astounding. The Quran provides a clinical, step-by-step dissection of elite bad faith.
Break it down.
Look again at the assassination plot against Salih. Their immediate thought after agreeing to murder the reformer is the manufacture of a false narrative.
We will say to his guardian, we were not present.
Exactly. This is the preemptive manufacture of false testimony. They are asserting their innocence in advance.
They are creating the narrative before the event even happens. It is the assertion of non-involvement as a social alibi.
Yes.
And if you zoom out, the source material argues that this is not an isolated incident.
Oh, it's a recurring pattern.
This is the standard operating procedure of the Mala across all eras. When faced with a structural reformer, the elite never, ever engage the reformer on the actual merits of the argument.
Because engaging on the merits is a guaranteed losing battle for a monopoly.
Of course.
If the 9 men debate Salih on the economics of water distribution, they lose. The mathematical reality is that their hoarding is destroying the working class.
The numbers don't lie.
Right. So they resort to a highly predictable playbook.
Yeah.
Step 1, labeling and silencing.
They attack the messenger to distract from the message.
Exactly. The reformer is labeled a madman, a sorcerer, a disgruntled employee, a criminal.
Think about your own workplace or political environment for a second, Have you ever seen a whistleblower point out a massive, undeniable flaw in a corporate project, only to have the management immediately pivot to discussing the whistleblower's attitude?
Oh, all the time. They're just not a team player.
Exactly. The data is totally ignored, and the character of the diagnostic tool is attacked.
Yeah, that's step 1. Then step 2 of the playbook is manufacturing a false social consensus against a reformer.
How do they do that?
The elite use their control of the media, the town square, or, in modern terms, the social algorithms. They use it to make it appear as though everyone agrees the reformer is a dangerous threat.
They make the reformer seem toxic.
Right. And finally, step 3. When intellectual engagement is avoided and the reformer's message still gains traction, the elite move to physical elimination with fabricated deniability.
Wow.
The 9 men of Thamud are not an anomaly. They are the permanent archetype of the corrupt board of directors facing the prospect of structural change.
This is where the lecture shifts focus, and honestly, it gets incredibly uncomfortable for the average listener.
It really does.
Because the 9 men couldn't maintain this livestock monopoly, and they couldn't execute this political assassination without the structural support of the broader society.
No, they needed compliance.
We have to examine the complicity of the masses, the illusion of the innocent bystander.
Yet, the analytical framework fundamentally rejects the idea that the masses are innocent victims if they remain silent, while the elite dismantle the correction mechanism.
And the lecture uses a fascinating framing device to explore this, a theoretical dialogue in hell.
It's essentially a post-collapse autopsy of a civilization.
Right. The society has crumbled, and in the ruins, you have 2 groups. The followers, representing the everyday citizens, and the leaders, representing the elite Mala.
And the followers immediately point the finger at the elite.
They use the classic abdication of responsibility. They say, you misled us. You laid traps day and night. It is your fault we are in these ruins.
It's the Nuremberg defense applied to sociology. We were just following orders. We were just trying to survive.
Right. But the response from the leaders is chillingly accurate.
It is. They look at the masses and say, we didn't force you. We didn't have the physical manpower to force every single one of you to comply. You gave us the power.
And the source material explicitly draws a modern political analogy here.
Yeah, the leaders say, you supported us, you voted for us, you eagerly followed our false promises because you didn't want to walk the straight path.
See, I have to grapple with this because it feels incredibly harsh to the working class.
It is harsh.
Is it truly fair to blame a single disenfranchised shepherd for the actions of a massive, heavily armed political machine?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If the 9 men control the water, the military, and the media, what is the average citizen supposed to do? Why is their silence considered a crime?
It's considered a structural crime because remaining silent when you have the capacity to resist even slightly provides the necessary friction to keep the corrupt machine running.
Okay, I see.
A society doesn't collapse just because 9 men in a boardroom are corrupt.
Right.
A society collapses because the masses choose the comfort of the corrupt status quo over the friction of reform.
Wow.
The straight path that Salih offered required actual sacrifice.
It wasn't just a mindset shift.
No, it required the average citizen to stand up, face the elite, and demand equal water rights. It required giving up the predictable, albeit unjust, routine of their daily lives for a chaotic restructuring.
And they just preferred the predictable injustice of the elite over the rigorous demands of systemic reform.
Exactly. The text is arguing that there is no such thing as an amoral bystander in a failing system.
Silence is active complicity.
Yes. If you watch the elite murder the internal diagnostic tool and you do nothing, you are the mortar holding the corrupt bricks together.
Which means the failure of the civilization is distributed across the entire population.
It's a collective failure.
And because the entire society was complicit in silencing the feedback loop, the entire society faced the inevitable mathematical consequence.
And this brings us to the mechanics of collapse, what the source material refers to in Urdu as mukafat An-Naml,
The law of requital.
the law of requital.
Now, we must strip away the theological baggage from this term, right?
Absolutely.
Mukafat An-Naml is not divine retribution. It is not a moody deity throwing a lightning bolt because he was offended by their lack of faith.
No, it is the precise, unavoidable, systemic consequence of collective actions.
It is the physics of society.
Beautifully put, yes. If you drop an apple, gravity pulls it to the ground. If you silence the only mechanism that can fix your rotting infrastructure, the infrastructure collapses.
It's a mathematical certainty.
The causality is absolute. Look at verse 27.50. They planned a plan, and we planned a plan, while they perceived not.
Okay, what does that mean in systems terms?
What this means is that the elite planning committee thought they were successfully exploiting the system. They thought their midnight assassination had hacked the social architecture. But the natural laws of civilizational decay were already operating against them.
The system plots back.
The system always plots back.
The elites thought they were the architects, but they were just playing inside a larger machine they didn't really understand.
Right. When they eliminated Salih, they didn't just kill a man.
They sent a signal.
Exactly. They sent a signal to the entire working class that reform was impossible.
And imagine the economic stagnation that follows an event like that.
It's devastating. Innovation dies. The marginalized stop contributing to the communal infrastructure because they know the system is permanently rigged against them.
Why build a house if you know the landlord can just take it?
Exactly. The status quo they were trying to preserve was already terminally compromised. The community was irrevocably split. The productive architecture was degrading due to the severe resource monopoly.
So eliminating Salih didn't save their society?
Not at all. It simply removed the brakes from a train that was already heading off a cliff.
Wow.
The law of requital is the mathematical reality that a society bleeding its working class dry will eventually lack the foundational strength to maintain its own walls.
And the imagery the Quran uses for the aftermath of this mathematical certainty is just haunting.
It really is.
Verse 27.52. Those are their houses, ruined because of their wrongdoing, not ruined because God got angry. Ruined because of their wrongdoing, their systemic facade.
The ruins are the archaeological record of a social architecture that chose systemic corruption over systemic correction.
That's a powerful sentence.
The empty houses stand as a permanent material monument to what happens when a vested interest successfully silences its own reform impulse.
And to reinforce this point, the source material briefly contrasts Thamud with another society mentioned in the text, the people of Lot.
Yeah, this provides another crucial data point for the exact same systemic failure.
Right. In that society, they legally sanctioned unnatural behavior, but more importantly for our systems analysis, look at how they treated the reformers.
This is the key part.
They literally passed a resolution saying, drive them out of your city. Indeed, they are people who keep themselves pure.
The system couldn't tolerate the contrast.
Right. The very existence of people living sustainably and ethically highlighted the society's corruption.
So instead of undergoing the friction of reform, they expelled the pure people. They forcefully ejected their own correction mechanism.
It is the exact same pattern as Thamud, just a different symptom of the disease. A system that rejects its diagnostic tools is universally destined for the ruins.
Universally.
Which brings us to the grand synthesis of the lecture. We need to look at the architectural placement of the Thamud narrative within the broader text of Surah 27 because it is not placed there by accident.
No, it's part of a very deliberate comparative sociology.
Let's hear it.
The structural composition of Surah 27 is brilliant. Just before we arrive at the ruins of Thamud, the text gives us the story of Solomon's state.
Okay, Solomon?
And how is Solomon's civilization depicted? It is an empire that functions flawlessly.
Why?
Because its primary operational principle is the maximization of information flow.
Maximizing information flow.
Right. Solomon listens to all corrective signals, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. He processes data from a hoopoe bird. He adjusts the march of his armies based on the communication of an ant.
He minimizes the suppression of data. The state is hyper-aware of its own vulnerabilities.
It embraces the diagnostic tools.
And then immediately following that masterclass in sustainable systems engineering, the Surah gives us Thamud,
The anti-state.
the anti-state, a civilization that destroyed itself precisely because it explicitly silenced the one actor generating accurate, disruptive information about the system's flaws.
What we are arriving at is a permanent principle of human organization.
Let's hear the principle.
Every social system, every corporation, every political entity contains within itself two opposing forces.
Okay.
It contains the mechanism for its own correction, the honest signal, the disruptive evidence, the reformer. And it contains the mechanism for its own destruction.
The elite planning committee.
Yes, the committee that calculates that killing the correction is preferable to undergoing it.
And the historical window dressing changes, obviously. The specific context shifts over the millennia.
Sure, we don't have literal she-camels acting as stress tests for agricultural monopolies today.
Right. And we don't have ancient cities carved into sandstone cliffs. But the sociological architecture remains absolutely permanent.
The 9 men exist in every era.
They really do. They are sitting in corporate boardrooms. They are leading political action committees. They are running media conglomerates.
The bad faith, the manufacture of consensus, the suppression of the diagnostic tool, it's all happening right now.
And the Quran's verdict on the ruins of Thamud is not, God punished the wicked in the past.
No. The verdict is, this is what a productive system looks like after it has successfully silenced its own correction mechanism.
Man, the journey we've taken today completely reframes how we look at stability versus fragility in our own systems.
A total paradigm shift.
We started with what appeared to be a simple, ancient morality tale about bad guys and a prophet, and we've untacked it as a rigorous manual on the sociology of systemic collapse, the lethal bad faith of elites, and the fatal mathematical cost of silencing corrective feedback.
If you take one extrapolative thought away from this deep dive, let it be this.
Yeah, give it to us.
If the ruins of Thamud are the material record of a society that successfully silenced its own internal diagnostic tool, take a hard look at the institutions, the corporations, or the political systems around you today.
Okay.
When you see a system actively punishing its whistleblowers, suppressing raw data, or manufacturing artificial consensus to protect a monopoly, are you looking at a thriving, stable enterprise?
Probably not.
Or are you just looking at a modern version of an empty house waiting for the structural rot to finally catch up with it?
Wow. Remember that X-ray we talked about at the beginning? Sometimes the most dangerous fractures in our society are the ones the system aggressively refuses to let you photograph.
Exactly.
Keep questioning the architecture around you, keep looking for the diagnostic tools, and never settle for the prepackaged alibi. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.